The interest in open source has been growing rapidly over the last few years as individuals and companies have looked to expand their toolkit to answer that wide range of questions that are facing today's clinical data scientists. The inclusion of open source content technology in drug development and the provision of open source content to the community has created a number of opportunities, but I'm sure many of us are familiar with the fact that we've also encountered barriers in the adoption of open source. The benefits of open source approach have been much discussed and include things like the development of more robust and well thought out solutions with shared development and maintenance efforts, avoiding the need to reinvent the wheel each time. It can lead to the harmonization on data generated and submitted to health authorities, which benefits sponsors in terms of greater efficiencies, and health authorities by minimizing variation between companies, and by having one common way of translating data to insights. It also helps to establish methods, facilitating replication across studies, and can help drive the development of standards. It's also importantly, it's the right thing to do for patients and society to pool skills and talents into collectively speeding up how the industry generates insights from patient data, and more broadly can actually help us attract new data scientists to the industry by adopting broadly accepted working practices. So I'd like to introduce the panelists. You will be able to see their biographies on your screen. So I'm going to just introduce them very quickly. We have Olivier Leconte, who's the Global Head of Programming at Janssen. James Black, the Insights Engineering People and Product Family Lead at Roche. Andy Nicholls, who's the Head of Data Science in the Statistics and Data Science Innovation Hub at GSK, as well as being the R Validation Hub Lead. Mark Lamprecht, who's the Director of Global Health and Life Science Practices at SAS. Mike Stackhouse, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at Atorus, and also the PHUSE Data Visualization and Open Source Technologies Working Group Lead. And Sam Hume, who's the Vice President of Data Science at CDISC. We're interested in hearing your questions as well for this panel, so please do put those in the Q&A box and we will pick those up during the discussion. But first, I'd like to hand over to Olivier to kick off the session. Okay, we're going to try and get Olivier back. He seems to have lost his connection briefly. So while we're trying that, maybe we'll do this slightly out of order, and I'll hand over to you, James.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. It's my first time using this tool, so I hope the slides have changed.
There we go. Yes, it's working.
Yeah, so I'll mention some specific organizations and libraries. This is kind of my personal musings, so nothing you see here is a position Roche is taking on particular libraries. I'm just using them to kind of connect them to things that we all understand and know. So we've been consumers of open source for a really long time. You know, there's base R, LaTeX, Tidyverse, Python, multiple Linux distributions. There's many examples of us consuming code, so pulling down open source code and using it in our studies. We've also been pretty good for decades at releasing code. So an example that I think every farmer can speak to is pushing up statistical packages to CRAN. And traditionally, these packages just kind of sat there. Like we were releasing them out, people would use them, but we weren't kind of actively trying to get collaboration all of the time. And, you know, some of these, they were pushing it directly from the machine to CRAN. Other ones, you know, you'll see pull requests that are 2 years old, and they're not actively looking to introduce suggestions or work on issues that people flag. So this is kind of a one-way door of open sourcing, where we push code out and people can consume it if they want. But I think the exciting point we're at now is that what used to be kind of the exception is starting to become more and more of the norm, which is where we're really trying and sometimes succeeding to get meaningful collaboration to take place. And I think it's definitely exciting that there's this growing thirst to collaborate on the code we write between companies, particularly in that post-competitive space. So that's kind of where the recent explosion has been. So these packages and code bases that take clinical trial data and convert it into, at the very end, a filing. So in terms of like these packages that we use and these libraries that we use and these even down to the operating systems we use, the next question is like, does it matter where they come from? And in the Git sense, you know, the driver of an open source project is basically who has control of the main or production branch, and to a lesser degree, the wider repo. And I'm going to kind of roughly break these into 3 categories. So there's that group, which we never really thought about. So I've used a certain operating system for years. I've never even thought about who controls like updates to it and its roadmap. I looked for the first time to do this course, and it seems to have some model of kind of a benevolent dictator who's on top of the project with a group of trusted people below him. But this was something I never really kind of thought about. And I guess this is slightly tied to the fact that, you know, we're not, most of us at least, are not actively contributing code towards the operating systems that we use. Then there are those things that we rely on that are a little bit closer to data science. So RINF is a good example, which is used, I think, across most likely every pharmaceutical company to manage our package versions now. And it's a fairly critical piece of our toolset. And it's in a language that a lot of us understand. And there kind of gets back again to, well, is anyone actually questioning the governance of this project? Like, do we just kind of trust it's going to continue to grow in a direction that helps us? Things get a lot more interesting and I think confusing when we start to talk about a single pharmaceutical company. And when it's either our own package or we're using a package that's governed by someone else from a different company. And it's something I think where we need to kind of understand, like, is there really an issue here? And I guess where we're heading, hopefully at the moment, is this all comes down to the license. So when we think about governance and ownership, it's the copyright, but does it really matter if there's a license that allows permissive use of this code base? And so if you can imagine there was a package or a library we make with another pharma, it's their package and library. They're not giving us control to master, but we still contribute some improvements. But then eventually there's a falling out. And so this could be most likely something fundamental, where it couldn't just be throw in some extra parameters or functions. Now, whether this is a problem or not falls down onto which license it's been open sourced under. And with the right license, there really isn't that much of an issue. So we could just take this code, fork it on the day there was a disagreement, and continue kind of to develop it towards our own vision while giving acknowledgement to the original code that's being modified. So we obviously lose those shared gains we could have got through collaboration, but we don't have to worry about just losing access to the code base or having massive disruptions. We still have that code and we can still use it, and we can take it in a new direction on a fork. So then, assuming we're now fine on that aspect of the governance, there's that second question, which I think a lot of us are facing, which is when there's an imbalance in terms of who's contributing to the project, and how does that affect how we want to approach the governance and the roadmap and things like that. So for one example, you may have quite a mature code base, which has had a team working on it. You know, in modern times, they're probably an agile team, so you've got kind of like 8 to 10 people in the Scrum team working on sprints, and they have a backlog, and they have daily stand-ups and stuff like that, and that's a lot of resources. And then another pharma company might come along and say, hey, we're interested in this, but we can only contribute 2 people at 30%. And then I think there's a lot of discussions there that needs to happen around, well, you know, this is a business critical tool we're investing heavily into and open sourcing. How do we pull in these kind of contributors that might be a little bit more casual, but we still want to build them towards becoming fully involved and committed to the project long term. And then another aspect of that is when we do open source mature code bases, which is something quite common in the post-competitive space, it starts to get a little bit difficult to contribute. So you can imagine if there's 10,000 lines of code and you're jumping into this, at the beginning, you may only be able to contribute kind of small snippets or ideas, or not even code, just ideas to the project. And to actually get to the point where you're able to make meaningful contributions, it might actually require a huge lead-in and a commitment to integrate this into your workflows. So these are all topics I have no answers to, but I think they're topics that we've been having multiple discussions on. And I think I'm definitely hopeful that as the course of this panel and future conversations that happen afterwards, I can kind of get a better idea of what the way forward is for when we do collaborate with other companies. And yeah, I can pass it back to you now, Chris.
Thanks, James. So this is the point in the time where I can look very silly and say, over to Olivier again. Hopefully we've got you back.
Can you hear my lovely French accent this time?
We can indeed. Lovely to hear you.
Awesome. Sorry for that. Not sure what happened. I could hear you all, and I was shouting like, I'm here, I'm here. All right. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, James, for filling in for me. Appreciate it. I think, the way I wanted to kick off that discussion and, and allow, all my peers presenters to then, go through their thoughts and points. So like, we often think of open source as one thing, open source language. And I think for the discussions, there's, for me, there's like it's a three-dimensional. So yes, open source IT products. And, in his slide, I think, James alluded to some of them. They can be an operating system, they can be a programming language, and so on. And I think that's definitely a lens we are all looking at. Is like, R, Python, various packages on CRAN, and so on. So all these ideas about, how do we contribute to progress an IT tool, a software tool, to be able to do more and more. And so that's one lens. I think within the pharma industry, we're also looking open source as a process, and how we cope with the process of open source. With our process mindset, often we're thinking validation. So how do I validate an open source package or an open source product to use it into our highly regulated environment? And I think, today is an exceptional event because we have pharma and regulators and, agencies on the call. And I think, it's a very interesting way to think about it. But, it's also like, okay, how do I select? Or, James was alluding to the governance process, which I think is a, very important part of what we do. There are multiple working groups across the industry, PHUSE, but also, other bodies like Transliterate and so on are trying to really resolve or say, okay, how do I select and validate that I'm using? So that process part is very important. And in my day-to-day interaction with my team, who is in charge of R and Python implementation at Janssen, there's not a single meeting where this question about, okay, but what does it mean from a regulatory? Are we able to use it? And so that process element is very important. And so those two dimensions are maybe the ones that are being the most discussed. The one dimension, which I think is very important, is mindset. And for me, open source is a mindset. Is this idea that I will use a product developed by someone else. I think at a very high level, all, data scientists and statistical programmers are used to that. But so yes, we're using SAS, we're using RStudio, we're using, I don't know, and then Timo, I think I've mentioned 3 different, providers. So I'm kind of ethically correct, and there's maybe much more, you could add. But when it comes to my program, am I really ready to share it with someone? Am I really ready to say like, well, maybe there's someone else doing better program than I do? Having led, statistical programming organization for the 10+ years, I cannot count the number of SAS macros I've seen that are used to, collect all CSR outputs into a single PDF with a table of contents. And each time we try to say, well, we're going to have one macro to do it all, there's someone saying, well, yeah, but my macro is doing it a little bit differently. And I think that's where the mindset comes in, because even if you think about an open source mindset, we could have implemented open source mindset 10 years ago, 15 years ago. SAS is actually a very, I would argue, is an open source software in the sense that the same SAS program can run almost the same way on every machine and platform, pending, obviously some exceptions. But when we try to say, hey, I have this set of amazing safety tables, why is not everybody else using it? Even PHUSE tried that not that long ago, I think that through some CSS working groups to say, hey, we have standard codes. The use of a standard code has been limited. And so for me, that was an initial example of open source. So I think, I'm sure today we'll discuss the softwares, the tool, the governance, the processes, how do we ensure that this is validated. But I think as we're going through the discussion, I'd love to hear thoughts from the peers, but also from you on the attendee side about how do we change that mindset? How do we ensure that tables provided by company X are they fine to be used by company Y? Because for me, that's maybe the biggest threshold we need to overcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivier. And as Olivier mentioned, if you do have any comments or questions, please do drop them in the Q&A box, and we will address them on an ongoing basis through that. But I think before that, I'll hand over to Andy for your perspective.
Well, I'll start. Here's a picture of me. I have a history of presenting with poor video quality. So if you're wondering what I look like in front of some trees, there is a picture of me in case the video is not very good today. I've been using open source for 15, 16 years now, and I've got a long history with it, particularly around the R language. So I used to be a professional trainer in R and taught many courses to hundreds and hundreds of people. I've written a book and so on. So I've got lots I can talk about with respect to experiences with open source. I've seen the good of it. I'm a massive fan of it, or I wouldn't have been using it for 15 years. And I've seen some of the challenges as well, the sort of mixed responses you get when you have you submit a package to CRAN, or you tell a package author that you don't think you don't think they've implemented something correctly. There's good and there's bad points about open source. But why I'm really here today is representing the R Validation Hub. Now, that is very much an R-based movement, but you can take that and take our ideas and apply it to all open source. The reason that the R Validation Hub was formed was not so much to address the question of validation. I think the word validation is a misnomer, and maybe we'll come up. We'll talk about that a bit more in the discussion. But really, it's to address something that isn't really a problem with closed source. So if you can see the diagram in the top right, if that's come across well enough, the challenge you have with open source that you don't have with closed source is the variety of different tools available. So with closed source software, you have one company, one owner producing that software, and they will have various standards, software development lifecycle, things like that they adhere to and follow when they produce that software. And if you don't, if you're unsure about adopting that vendor's software, you can go in normally and you can go and audit them and check that they're following their processes and so on and so forth. Now, in the open source world, you tend to have a core. So in this case, this is R, and you have what are called the base and recommended packages at its core. But Python and other languages work very, very similar. You normally have a core group of individuals, and James touched on this as well with Linux distribution as well. You have a core person or persons who are responsible for a language. They will follow some kind of processes. And if you're lucky, like in the case of R, they'll produce documentation as well that show you what they do to produce the software, how qualified they are, how they manage releases, bugs, etc., etc. But you often have thousands, 20,000 in the case of R, packages, libraries, modules, call them what you will, that can be written by a huge number of different people, individuals sometimes large organizations, and that quality varies greatly. And you're not going to be able to go in and audit every individual package or module that you want to use. So with the R Validation Hub, what we've tried to focus on is what actually are the regulations, what do we need to do in this space to try and manage that and use a tool like R, or it could well be, as I say, Python, anything else for GXP work. There is a minimal amount of information in terms of guidance in this area. If you look at ICH E9, there's essentially a paragraph, and here's a snippet from there. It talks about the words that I've highlighted there: reliability of the software, and talking about documenting appropriate software testing procedures. And really, those are your challenges. Define reliable, and define what an appropriate level of testing and documentation should be. And really, there isn't much guidance beyond that. You'll see this reference, the FDA Statistical Software Clarifying Statement from 2015 mentions this, refers back to E9 and tries to provide further clarification, but no one really knows what it is we should do. But it is, if you think about the problem itself, essentially, as programmers, statisticians, data scientists, our job is essentially to take some data and analyze that data, produce some, and ultimately that we're going to produce some kind of summary, a table, a graphic, an app, or whatever it is. And we have to determine whether the results, the numbers, the p-value, whatever it is that we get out of the end, whether that is reliable. I think the word reliable is a really important word to use in this space. And here is an example of just some R code summarizing some numbers. I can look at that and I can see intuitively, and I think intuition is a really, really important part of this process of determining if something is reliable. I can intuitively see, yes, the minimum is 1, the maximum is 5 of these 5 numbers that I fed in here. I know the mean, the standard deviation seems plausible. So immediately I have some intuition. But as I start to get some more advanced statistical models, that intuition doesn't disappear, but it becomes harder to determine if something is reliable, and especially if I'm repeating that code over and over again, producing tools and so on. So I'm not going to walk through this slide in lots of detail. I've highlighted this from another presentation that I've given on this topic. But what I do want to draw your attention to is the 3 points on the right-hand side. So I've mentioned intuition. The bottom one I drew your attention to, software development lifecycle. If you're buying a closed source piece of software, typically what you would do is if that's a new vendor that you're buying that from, you don't know much about them, you go in and audit them, and you'd audit their processes, and you'd want to be sure that they develop that software following a very strong software development lifecycle, including testing at various points, control over releases, and they have the relevant documentation that you would expect. In the open source world, I'd actually argue it's easier to do that because much of that development takes place in the open. In the case of R, many R packages are available on GitHub, and you can go and you can have a look and you can see, okay, I can drill into the source code, see how that's developed, see how often people are committing code there, see how they respond to bugs that are reported by users. So there's actually a lot of information that's out there that gives you a feel for how the software is developed, even if they have no formal documentation, if you like, over what they do. And the other element that I think is really, really important, particularly in the open source, is the community exposure. Now, this applies to open source or closed source. If I'm often comfortable using something if I've read about it somewhere, if I've seen a paper or I've seen any form of publication that has used a piece of software to do a type of analysis, then that gives me a lot more confidence that that software does what it's claiming to do, because there is analysis there that's been published, it's been peer reviewed using that software. And over time, the more you see things published, if you like, the more we file for submission with a piece of software, or the more you see results published in journals, the more confidence you can get. The more people that use the software, the more confidence you get from that software as well. And these are all things that we can collect and establish as well. So just to wrap up, I mean, through the R Validation Hub, we propose methods for assessing this, and I think it is easy enough to collect information like this for open source software, develop documentation that can demonstrate that software is reliable. But of course, the biggest challenge is what to do if you're unsure. What if something isn't widely used? What if you don't have that exposure to the user community? What if you don't have the citations of something very cutting edge? And one of the reasons to use open source is to get access to the cutting edge methods. So what do you do in those cases? How do you test? How much do you test? And I think those, just to finish on a challenge, those are the real challenges we face with open source. I'd be interested to expand on that a little bit later in the discussion.
Thanks, Andy. I think it's an interesting point you make around sort of breaking these down to these three different points. I'll now hand over to Mark for you to kick off your views on open source from maybe a more of a closed source background initially.
Absolutely, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. And thank you, first of all, for inviting me as well to this great panel of speakers talking about a very important topic, right? I think the first thing I want to say, I'm here to share what I learned about open source myself from a personal point of view, even though I work at SAS, and that is important. I used open source in the past. Working at a biopharmaceutical company, I've programmed in R and Python, and also now, having worked 16 years at SAS, obviously can compare a lot the approaches that we are taking within SAS with open source. And before jumping into a couple of topics, I want to say I agree with everything that has been said before, and on how, especially where Olivier talked about open source is a mindset. Definitely agree with that, and as well with Andy and how he looked at open source. Want to get one elephant out of the room as we look at the SAS and the idea, and as you mentioned, closed source. SAS is actually a big aficionado of open source. We use a lot of open source in the way that we create technology ourselves. We've also host systems that can run R, that can run Python next to SAS as a language, because it is more, I would like to expand the discussion a little bit beyond the language as well. It's more than just a language. There's a couple of things that are needed here to deal with clinical data and to deal with outcomes and generating insights than just the language that you use to express yourself, to manipulate the data, or to analyze actually the data itself. And so we're a strong believer of that. We use R ourselves, we use Python for certain tasks, and we believe that Julia and other languages will become more popular and certainly mixed into the technology stacks that we're hosting. Also great work by the R Validation Hub to look at which packages are core and which ones are more high risk. Because it makes it easier for us to host some of those R packages as well, and to recognize which ones are easier to host. It's definitely true that it's more work, I think, to qualify those instances of R, as you want, rightly so, as Andy pointed out, make sure that the results are reliable in the hands of statistical programmers and that we can reproduce those results. Open source is a mindset, and I want to congratulate PHUSE for what you have done, because since the start of PHUSE, as people have been exchanging code, I've seen a lot of SAS code being compared. And this is an open source mindset, even though the compiler behind it, the packages we create, are proprietary and definitely part of our IP, and where we invest heavily in bringing the best analytical methods. The actual way that it's being used and compared is an open source mentality. And that's similar to how you do that in R or SAS. That doesn't really matter. So from our point of view, from my point of view, open source means that you help statistical programmers manage that risk and become specialists in that domain, whether you're working at a pharma company or at a technology provider. Being able to do, for example, vendor audits, software development life cycles, monitoring those quality oversights is important. You don't want the same lines of code, whether it's programmed in R or in other languages, to generate different results over time. And I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky as you try to qualify those environments, and where we need to work together to ensure that doesn't happen. After all, I think if technology is good, if it's fit for purpose, it will be used wherever it's coming from, whether we create it or whether it's developed by open source technology. Having said that, I do think there's a couple of other factors that we need to keep in mind as we talk about open source. That's evolution of the technology landscape. The debate has really shifted from the ability to program in a certain language to how can we analyze patient data, where there are so many requirements beyond the actual language itself and that environment. And if you look at clinical data analysis, I'm talking about auditing, security, managing your data, collaboration in an enterprise environment, qualification of software in a GXP compliance as explained by Andy, and all the facets that come with that, and doing data science as FUSE users and statistical programmers are truly embracing more different techniques and looking at more data. And in the backend, pure technologically, these systems, as we deploy them, have become cloud native. A lot of the data has moved to the cloud with new techniques such as open source techniques, again, like Kubernetes and programmers using that, GitHub, which we're using. And a good programmer, after all, should be able to use the best technique at the best moment for the job that needs to get done. I think the enhanced regulatory requirements are changing. There is more data there. Text data needs to be analyzed. Sometimes Python SAS combinations are for certain analytical routines, SAS for deep analytical packages. Maybe in the future, as I mentioned, Julia will become more prevalent. I think what is I'm seeing at FUSE is great in terms of training people, constantly training them, like the efforts that Sasha Arwaller and team are doing to set up this education website is important, and we're fully happy to contribute to that as well. But the final point, I think, where the success will be determined is the costs of the qualifying environment, the end-to-end costs, which might be different depending on the mix of open source and what you're trying to outsource as a community as well, and what you're focusing on and what you want to become a specialist in. And switching languages, for example, has a cost because you need to re-educate users and so on. Thirdly, I want to point at collaboration, and I think collaboration is important. Again, open source mindset, what CDISC and Sam will talk about in terms of what they're doing with open source, FUSE, other efforts like HIMSS, hackathons that are being set up where it's not so much, again, about the language, but what the result will drive. And we have collaborated, we've set up our own hackathons to drive innovation with different low-code, no-code environments to be more faster generating the insights that are needed by the scientists and providing that. And finally, support model. How can we provide the best support together if we look at open source or if we look at these environments? That's part of that open source mindset as well. And we certainly invested a lot in technical support there. I think we need to look at that as a community as well. The final element I want to point out is transformation. It's excellent to focus on open source and get excited about that technology, but behind it, the clinical landscape is changing. We're looking at trials that are more decentralized. There are other types of data coming in, and we need to look at, is the environment we're using fit for that purpose? So shifting a little bit the debate from the statistical programmer, as FUSE has done, from being a programmer to being a data scientist, to being that specialist that helps statisticians, being those talented experts of clinical data, whatever the back-end capability set is that you have. Also looking at the fact that there might be different patient needs, therapeutic needs, and I know FUSE has had a lot of events and conferences around the patient centricity, rightfully so, because that is important as statistical programmers and programmers and data scientists, which we are. We need to keep that in mind. I think just to finish up, Chris and team here, I think change will be the constant. I think it would we would fool ourselves if we think that we can establish one technology environment or language, and this will be the choice for the coming 10, 20 years. Change will be needed, and we need to also think about how can we keep embracing that change with new techniques, with AI, machine learning, what the FDA is talking about, the software as a medical device, and the impact it has on our open source mentality. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's a fascinating insight to see where we are on that side and the balance across the entire board. So, Mike, you've been leading the data visualization and open source technologies working group and the open source project before that for some time. What are your thoughts on the current open source picture?
Yeah, so coming into the FUSE and PharmaSoc circuit 5-10 years ago, it's just amazing to see the amount of progress that has been made over the last few years themselves. Going back then, there was very sparse talk about open source, very little talk about R, very little talk about Python, a very SAS-dominated world. With the presentations that we see out at the conferences, but that has shifted dramatically, particularly in the last few years. And this is due to a lot of the work of people that we see here today. With the groups like the R Validation Hub and the work that Andy has done, we're finally starting to shift our questions away from can we to how. And that's a really important distinction, because a lot of the presentations that I would see 5 years ago, the only question you would ever get is it's not validated, so we can't use it, right? And we're finally starting to see changes in that conversation, and presentations more about implementation, presentations geared towards how people are using these things, and more practical usage. And within FUSE, data visualization open source technology has given its own home to working groups that can focus on these sort of efforts. And there's real productive efforts coming out of this. Recently, FUSE has established a relationship with the R Consortium so that we can cross-pollinate efforts. There's a lot of work going on in the R Consortium right now focused around pharma. Pharma is a major consumer of R, and R Consortium has identified that. So we have projects like R tables for regulatory submissions, looking at how we can better build up tools and the different efforts and the different tools within the open source ecosystem that can help support the production of tables that we use in regulatory submissions, much like we're producing largely in SAS today. And R for regulatory submissions, that's actually doing a pilot to try to get an R package through the ECTD and try to address some of those questions so that we can have more tangible things to point to in the community. And more tangible evidence of the work that we can do. Within FUSE itself, we have Ellis's project focused in that has yielded real results, like the production of the package val tools that helps us with validation documentation focused around open source efforts, or just automating some of these things and making those processes and those procedures and those documentation steps easier to overcome. And then the project Clinical Statistical Reporting in a Multilingual World has been making great progress towards answering questions post-validation, because something that isn't as largely talked about, but it's talked about here and there, is the fact that when you're using different languages, you need to understand that those implementations may be different, that you're going to have questions to answer, such as the simple cases of the fact that R uses a different default rounding methodology than SAS out of the box. So R rounds to even, where SAS rounds to 5 up by default. Those are questions that you're going to come across, but those are the basic ones. In linear models, your contrasts might be set identically, or there are differences in the implementations of mixed models currently. These are things that get difficult to answer, and part of what we're doing in clinical statistical reporting in a multilingual world is addressing some of those questions and looking into the actual implementations and looking at the comparisons between them, but also starting to establish a framework of how do we address these things as we come up in the future, because they're difficult questions to answer, but they're inevitable no matter what language that you're comparing, because it's not quite reasonable to expect that the implementations are going to be exactly identical. So those are hurdles that we're going to have to come across, but being multilingual with statistical analyses and the tools that we use is inevitably extremely important as we move forward, because like the other points that we've talked about today, the differences in data that we're collecting, the differences in analyses that we're doing, the direction that we should be going is using the best tool for the job, instead of limiting people to just what we have available in our systems at the time. But one of the really relevant points that I think was brought up by Olivier talking about the mindset, or James talking about what's competitive. I really like James's term post-competitive, because a lot of the value in pharmaceutical companies is going to be your molecule or the drug they're actually distributing. It's not going to be the edge that you have from an R package that you have internally to produce some summary table. That's not where we're going to get our advantage. So part of where we need to move is just accepting that those items, those R packages, Python packages, SAS macros, whatever you have, are not intellectual property that we need to hold on to with our dear life and license extremely restrictively, or make sure that we keep that in touch and held close to the vest. Code for basic SDTM or atom derivations, or things like safety table generation, is just not where we're getting our competitive edge. And the one thing, James made a point that there's been a lot of sharing going on in industry, and that's very true. I just was looking today, and the dose finding package in R was released in 2013, and there's a paper around that. But that was a collaboration, and the authors of the paper around that are from Janssen and Novartis. So this cross-pharma pollination is something that has been going on, but we don't see that as much in the clinical reporting side of things, where we're doing SDTM through TLFs for the purpose of submission to a regulatory agency. That's not as common, but in recent history, that is starting to change. And that's where, on this slide, if I push it to the audience, there is now precedent around releasing a lot of these different things. So that comes in the form of many different things. Merck has released R2RTF and PackageLite. Those are both open source and packages that they've developed internally and just pushed out. They released it. Both of those packages are up on CRAN today. Roche released RTables, and they have their synthetic CDISC data package that they've also just released on GitHub. Biogen recently put out the Shiny application Tidy CDISC. And Atorus ourselves have put out the packages tPlier and Pharma RTF. And these are things that we've identified and just from the start accepted that that's not our competitive advantage. We'll release it with an open, permissive MIT license and put it out to the world because we want other people to benefit from these things. And I think Olivier made the point, but really trying to get towards serving the patients. If we develop something that we think can be advantageous for others to use and can help get these things produced faster, it's something that belongs out there in the open source because others can contribute to what we're producing and make our packages better, and they can also take advantage of what we've released. But furthermore, in the clinical space, something interesting that has been happening lately in the last year or so is cross-organization collaboration. So Atorus and GSK, we came together and from the start aimed to produce permissive license packages, and that yielded Timber, Exporter, and Metacore. And then this model is also continuing with Roche and GSK with the production of Admiral aimed towards producing Atom data transformations. So this is something that is becoming more commonplace, and we're accepting the facts that it's not IP that we want to hold dearly, looking at the collaboration models, establishing upfront the governance of how those things will be handled, the ownership of the package, and aiming for permissive licensing. And it doesn't matter if you're pharma, it doesn't matter if you're CRO. This is something where these collaboration models can extend. Atorus is a vendor. We are a technology services company, and we collaborated with GSK. Roche and GSK are two pharmas coming together to collaborate. This is something that no matter where you sit in industry, we really all stand to gain by collaborating on these things and pushing these models in the future. So thank you, Chris. Back to you, so you can hand it off to Sam.
Doing my job for me, Mike. Thank you. I think that's done. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Sam, yours.
Oops, there we go. One too far. There we are. Thank you. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes introducing the CDISC Open Source Alliance, or COSA. And the purpose, or I guess the mission really of COSA, is to support, promote, sometimes sponsor open source projects that have some impact, or they work with the CDISC standards in some way. They're helping to implement the standards, maybe even for standards development or governance. And the intent really is to drive innovation. So we see these projects as ways to advance innovation for those that are working with the standards. And one of the initial things that we targeted was producing a directory of projects that work with CDISC standards. The idea being that you got one place to go. You can find a list of open source projects that perform a variety of different functions. Some may be applications, some may be libraries and the like. But they all work with the standards. One place to go find them. We can help promote that and make sure that people are aware of the projects. There's more out there, I think, than many realize. And this is just a way to raise awareness and make it easy to find those projects. It's also the case that in terms of supporting projects, we want to allow individual projects to help get the word out about the particular value that they bring, and seek to do that through conference sessions, webinars, and other methods of communication that help to highlight particular open source projects in the space. Also thinking about building developer communities. So for a lot of projects, they're interested in getting more input, or they're looking for developers. It might struggle to do that a bit. So you can use hackathons or workshops or other mechanisms to help to build a developer community, or maybe jumpstart a project or drive a little innovation. So those are some of the things we kind of initially started thinking about when we set up COSA. It's evolved quite a bit because there's so much interest in it, even though we've really not really rolled it out. This is actually probably the first time I've talked in any kind of length about COSA, because it's still really brand new. But for example, it's evolved in that we're doing more in providing guidance for open source best practices, licensing, and IP, because these are questions that folks that are thinking about releasing software as open source have, and now we've got a little bit more expertise in the group, in the alliance, and partnering with Microsoft and others that bring quite a bit to the table in terms of an understanding of open source. So one question we get is, why is CDISC doing this? This is maybe different than what you're used to seeing from us. So I think one important takeaway is that CDISC, from a strategic perspective, is transitioning a bit to focus more on standards implementation, interoperability, and governance. Not to say we're not developing standards still, but focusing more and more on how do we lower the barrier, how do we ensure folks get full benefit from the standards and their implementations. You need tools to do it. That's just part of it. It's not all about metadata. You need the tools to help make that happen. So COSA aligns quite nicely with that. And actually, it initially got started as a follow-on to the CDISC 360 proof of concept project. If you're familiar with that, we were working on defining biomedical concepts and end-to-end automation. Again, to make that happen, you need tools, and so there were some proof of concept tools that were demonstrated. Lots of interest from the community. Hey, where can I get that? Interest from the teams, and continuing to develop the tools to take them out of the proof of concept stage and take them into something that's more production ready. But the project had ended, and so COSA was the initiative that was created to provide a way so that CDISC can still work with these teams and support their efforts. One example of a project there that was pretty popular was the TLF designer. So there was a nice designer that was set up that folks had an interest in. And again, we wanted to help that project to continue, since the authors really were quite excited to carry on. It's also true that CDISC is producing some open source software as well, as you may have heard. For example, our core project, the CDISC Open Rules Engine project, is a collaboration between CDISC, Microsoft, and industry. That's going to be part of COSA, so that came along a little later. It's a big project. There's lots of moving parts in the effort from a software perspective, but also from a validation and QA perspective as well. And that's helped to drive also some more kind of expansion on the ideas of what COSA will bring to the table. So as we thought about core, one of the things that we're working on is an industry kind of volunteer-led collaborative effort to produce the QA and validation documents that will help support people using it. And we want that to carry forward into COSA in general. So we're thinking about, things that we can do to help out projects, and one of them is likely going to be a regulatory risk assessment for projects, also an IP assessment. Again, trying to lower the barrier for folks to go ahead and implement these projects without having to pick up a lot of that work on their own. And then the idea that we can have a collaborative, much like we develop open source software, you get people come together to help to do the development work. Yeah, we can do the same thing to help support QA and validation. So we're looking to sort of expand the footprint of COSA a bit and drive it towards being something a little closer to a open source accelerator, if you will. In terms of the current state, where are we? Just getting started, as I've mentioned. So we put a governance board in place. That board has set up some criteria for evaluating projects that will be included in COSA and added to the directory. Just started adding a couple projects at this point, and we're starting to reach out to others. So if you have open source software that we should be aware of and you haven't heard from us, that's why we're really just starting to roll this thing out. In fact, there hasn't really been officially a public announcement yet. So this is still very, very early, but we have made a start. We are starting to onboard projects, build up the directory. We are starting to schedule communication, conference sessions. We're working on our first hackathon. And so there's, you'll see a lot more coming in the near future. I'll also add that in our charter, one of the things that we set up was the notion that we will collaborate with other groups that are working on in the same area. And we haven't done that yet because we wanted to make a start first to get to the point where we had something to contribute. But we absolutely intend to reach out to the FUSE groups and others that are contributing to make sure that where we can align and help each other out, that we'll do so, and at the very least to make sure we're kind of rowing in the same direction. So that's a little introduction to the CDISC Open Source Alliance, or COSA.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everybody. I think that's really set the scene for the rest of this discussion that we're going to have today. One of the things that struck me particularly was how many of you mentioned mindset as a topic, and I've got folks who I work with who always talk around sort of making the right way to do something the easy way of doing it. And I'd be interested in your thoughts around how do we actually make open source the easy way of approaching a topic. So that's sort of making use of other people's codes, as you alluded to, Olivier, and then sharing them back. So maybe I'll start with you, Olivier. You sort of introduced mindsets initially. Is at the moment using open source and using other people's code just too difficult at the moment? Maybe building on some of the points Andy raised around reliability and trust.
So that's the $1 million question I think we're all trying to resolve. I believe, the things around, governance and validation and so on, we are all coming with very common answers. I think it goes with two things. I think first it comes with a let it go. And that's the hardest, maybe. So like, well, it was mentioned, yes, we having discussion and collaboration with Roche and GSK around using some of the R packages that are out there. And some of the discussion I'm having with my team. So like, well, we're just going to have to let it go. So like, it's not our code. And it's fine. We can use it. So I think, back to mindset, is that mindset of let it go. After that, I think there's a big discussion we need to have with our standard groups, our medical writing group, which I think also is a common discussion with every statistical programming organization. So like, well, does it really matter if a footnote is there? Does it really matter if, the placebo column is first and the comparator is second and our drug is third, or whatever you agree? So I think, it's really go through that. So I think there's a discussion of letting it go. There's a discussion around focusing on the numbers rather than the format. And for 20 plus years I've been in the industry, I think it's been a discussion where we are struggling. And I think, there's almost, and that one is even more challenging. There's an ego thing. As a programmer, you always try to build the nicest, most efficient program. And so how do you accept to do that collaboratively and saying, hey, I can add to it? I think we have many other examples where it worked. And I think we all worked as team. Adam data sets, for example, are so complex. There's not one person who can do it all, but it's to do it cross industry. So I think, these are some of the discussions that needs to happen. And it's really around this discussion, and talk about it and being able to speak up and share and then say, well, it's fine. I'm going to work with company X, Y, and Z and make it happen. I think, yes, there was an element in the past. It was easy. I would, use a vendor. and trust that vendor, and that vendor ensure all those things. So that also some of the challenges that we need to own more of it. So all of those, I think, are things that needs to be discussed. It's not something you can shift over time. You cannot shift in one night. You need to have discussions over and over. And I'm able to see some of the questions in the Q&A. Yeah, that relationship also with the health authorities, and it's also where it would be so easy for us if we had a guidance saying do this, do that. But I think that's the challenge. I think their guidance is about how we work, and but the level of granularity we are in when we talk about open source and how we use R or Python to do Adam data sets, I don't think there will ever be a guidance. And so as an industry, we need to come with it. So I think that is part of its challenges and the mindset discussions we need to have.
Thanks, Olivier. I'll return to the agency's point in a bit, maybe, because I know we definitely have a question around that. But Sam, you sort of introduced COSA, which seems to be a practical way of people to understand around open sourcing more, and CDISC operating some areas in that. How do you think COSA might actually contribute more to that area of making it easier for people to get into the mindset of working in an open source manner?
I think one thing is just an awareness of how much of it's already out there, how many people are using it. I mean, there are a fair number of applications that are available, and I think if people get the sense that, hey, this is becoming closer to common practice, that it does create the mindset that this is okay to do. And then I think within COSA and other efforts, the idea that we can collaborate not only on the software, but also on some of the other barriers around testing, validation, and things like that to produce packages that make it easier for folks to implement. So part of it is education, awareness. Hey, there's applications out there. This is what you need to do, and kind of coming to some sort of consensus of what it takes to implement open source. It's also an understanding that not all open source applications are in the same place in terms of some of them are still in development, not stable yet. Some may be deprecated. Some, come with validation packages ready to help out. So it's just an awareness that, yeah, this is being used much more commonly, and here's how to go about assessing whether it's right for you. I'll also add that I've seen some research recently that 96% of the applications that are out there today have some open source in it. So whether it's proprietary or not, you're probably using open source. The newer applications are about 80 to 90% open source these days. And so I think the most innovative companies are really focusing on that 10 to 20% that creates unique value for the project that they're working on. So from a mindset perspective, I think it's thinking in that way that, hey, for a lot of this stuff, we just don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's better to collaborate on it. And we just focus on those bits that we think are unique to what we're doing on this particular project.
Thanks, Sam. I think, Mike, you had something to add on this topic as well.
Yeah, and part of the question had started around adoptability and being able to embrace these things within your organization. And part of that, when we develop, if an organization develops something in a silo, it's inevitably going to be catered specifically to their needs. Olivier had made a point about things such as footnotes. And that's where a lot of these collaborations kind of become essential to get input from other organizations and other people doing the work in different ways. So when we look at some of these models, Atorus and GSK coming together, one of the first questions that we asked was trying to break things down to the generalizable points to make them useful and generically useful to different organizations, and not focused around the way Atorus does things, not focused around the way that GSK does things. And the same thing is happening with Admiral and Roche and GSK. They're looking and taking things from their two different perspectives of the very different implementations of how they do their work and trying to break it down into the generic components. So if we build these things together, then inevitably what we can do is build things that are accessible because they solve the generic problems. And then you're solving 80% of the complexity with the generic things that we're doing, and then you can customize that remaining 20% with the nuance within your organization. And that's one of the keys, I think, to making open source languages accessible as we move forward in the future. And the benefits of the more powerful libraries that we see out there, like tidyverse, that it's just generic data manipulation. It's the things that you're inevitably going to have to do when you're doing data science related work. Collaborative models and getting input from others based on how they do the work, and then seeing the similarities in the unique challenge or the generic challenges that we need to solve is the things that we should be pushing out there and making accessible to users.
Thanks, Mike. And maybe just following on from this and a comment Olivier made earlier about egos. So we do have that kind of, sometimes there's an institutional / standard difference between companies. And I would maybe stretch that ego definition to also include just passion, because there's a lot of like grassroots efforts that kick off where someone in a study wants to kind of simplify something or prevent having to duplicate code. They write a function, it gets used, then it gets turned into a package and it gets shared, and there's a kind of this grassroots uptake. And this is happening in every company. And by the time it surfaces, people are often quite passionate about it, and they've got 60 or 70% from their manager to work on it full time and to work on it, And I think that's another kind of little barrier that's there, where kind of realizing that, hey, you might be pretty passionate about this idea, but is it really that different from a slightly different approach another pharmaceutical company took to the exact same problem?
Thanks, James. Yeah. And yeah, just a reminder to everybody on the call, if you do have a question, please do put it in the Q&A. We have got a few coming in already, and I will pull them in at regular intervals and also address them at the end as well. So please do add them as we go along. In fact, I'm actually going to pull one of them in now, and maybe I'll address this to you, Mark, initially. And that's sort of what do you see as sort of the last barriers for pharma to embrace open source? And maybe we've talked about mindset a lot already, but what else do you see that's a barrier to embrace open source?
I think in terms of what we're looking at is the open mindset. I think we talked about the multilingual environment, right, and offering that. I think we need a lot more maturity in how we look at technology. And in the end, I think the clinicians that are looking at the results are convinced by the reliability and the risk. And they want to be able to trust the result that is coming to them and make sure that they have that they get it within the time they need, right? So I'm convinced that that will be done by mixed environments, multilingual environments. And I think getting over that means that you need to have specialists out there that are able to bring the best technology stack available in that qualified environment. I hear a lot about the different packages, for example, from R and Python, and mainly R here, that have been discussed. A lot of that is really being solved already. For example, if I look at what we are producing at SAS in terms of packages in a way that reduces the risk enormously. So I think it comes down to ensuring that you can show from the open source point of view that you're adding value beyond what is already there, and looking at the total cost of ownership as such. Sticking to one approach will likely not work. You've seen that we have a deep partnership, for example, with Microsoft, and you've seen how Microsoft has evolved in that open source realm and really embraced open source. It was one of the companies that really didn't do that. And I think that's really where we need to get in that mindset, share what is being doing, what is working well, and making sure that that we're not throwing away everything that has been done in the past, and we keep enriching these approaches with and have that open mindset going forward. One of the questions that came in, for example, was, can we use R for XPT submission? And that is already possible. I think the question is, how can we provide a better package to the FDA so that they can more easily review that type of data? And then again, a question beyond the actual choice of technology. XML, RDF formats like CDISC is working on is what we are investing in as a technology company, because we want to embrace that collaboration and that open source as well. So I think there's just a couple of elements that come to mind here.
Thanks, Mark. And Mike, I think you had some comments around that question that Mark's just picked up around being R-based data submitted to the agency as XBT. So maybe we'll address that one now.
Yeah, so that's something that is doable. In part of the collaboration of Atorus and GSK producing the exporter package, we made an enhancement to the SAS export package, which is open source and it has been around for quite a while to generate XBT files. Some of the remaining problems there were just getting it through things like the Pinnacle conformance checks and making sure that things are formatted properly for generation, and exporter wraps around that to make it easier. But so it's possible using packages that are out there to generate these compliant XBT files for submission. I think the real question is, why do we still use SAS version 5 export files? Because it's a very old format at this point, but there have been numerous initiatives aimed at trying to improve that over the years.
And just for the record there, I agree with that statement. And this format has been open sourced already. This is a kind of an urban myth living around in the industry, but it's open source since the early 90s. I think the FDA is actually looking at what standards could be used going forward. So we would very much embrace the CDISC format and the more metadata layered formats and rich formats that RDF and XML transport vehicles are offering. I absolutely agree with that, Mike.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. And those you were on the FDA plenary session on Monday would have heard Ginny mention around some initial discussions that are potentially kicking off the agency around that. But I'll refer you back to that presentation from Monday. But I'm just going to jump back in terms to barriers to fully going down the open source route and sort of bring James in on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I guess I can come at that from two angles. So I have my kind of real world data hat and then the clinical hat for the team that I'm in. And on the real world data side, we've been embracing open source end to end for a while now. Like, we use Postgres-based databases. It's been R or Python end to end. And but this doesn't, to Mark's point, this doesn't mean we're kind of free of paying someone money to help us. So if we talk about Postgres databases, a lot of the times we're still paying Amazon to access something like Redshift. Or if we talk about using R, we're still paying our studio for Shiny and for their IDE. So I think there's always, even if we kind of fully embrace open source and the set of code that takes raw data and converts it into something the FDA sees, that could be end-to-end open source. But there's going to be a whole bunch of kind of people and companies and experts, I think, along that pipeline who maybe aren't controlling the code that's present, but they're definitely controlling like the way this data is processed as it goes through to become a submission or become an insight.
No, thanks, James. And I'm going to pick up on something that a few people have talked about. I'll probably stick with you for initially for this one, James. There's quite a few people have talked around multilingual. Mark sort of mentioned it in the context of using the right tool to solve the right problem. Mike, you sort of talked it in a more specific sense in the PHUSE projects that's looking at the differences between different languages in executing the same data science activities. But James, what were your thoughts on this whole multilingual question?
Yeah, so I definitely agree, and I'm looking forward to Mike following up on his experiences in the working group. But I guess there's a question there, like, we want to know the differences, but we don't want to kind of use it as a crutch to validate, as I guess the stance that I would take. And that's more because there could be arbitrary decisions that go into this. And I think it gets even more confusing. If you talk about open source, then a lot of the core kind of scientific logic could be coming from multiple people in completely different packages. And so you end up even inside a language, which particular package you pick could change things quite dramatically based on defaults they pick, or they've only done a particular type of methodology, which differs slightly from what's been implemented in another package. And I think we do see that sometimes where, there's a package that came from computer scientists that are into prognostic modeling, And obviously, they're coming at this from a very different place than a statistician trying to do causal inference. So you do end up with these arbitrary differences. So I guess my only point to add to that would be, it's not just the language-to-language thing. It's also inside the language. As soon as it's open source, you're going to start seeing multiple implementations that differ based on different packages. Yeah, maybe I'll pass to Olivier.
Yeah, thanks, James. Just to rebound on the multilingual, and so, you know, changing a little bit my hat from someone who strongly believes in open source to be a functional head. The difficulty of transitioning from a single language shop that we've been using for 20 plus years to multilingual is something that worries a lot of the people within my staff and the people within the industry. So I think, you know, this is where we need to, I would say, we need to think twice almost about what we do and why we're doing. You know, discussion I'm having with my team is like, I don't want to turn from a SaaS shop to an R shop. There's room for both. Or even if I'm starting to introduce Python, and to James's point, if you think about R, there's multiple packages. You know, Mike showed a slide like there's all those packages emerging, you know, like which one I'm going to use. So I think, you know, you need to put also an operational lens at it. We need to have a very strong collaboration with statistics about, hey, you know, the R packages, there's so many of them. Maybe there's just one way to calculate a mean on average or standard deviation. But when you go into the more funky statistical procedures and so on, then you could pick many packages. So I think, you know, this is where we need to have a moderate approach of not going from one language to a lot of language to a lot of packages. So it brings back to the governance aspect, but more importantly, it goes with this idea of, you know, also having an operational aspect. Let's not change just because it's interesting, because everybody else is doing it, but let's change because it provides the values. If I'm, you know, my business case today to move to have more R is to say the vast majority of the people I'm hiring out of university, they already have several years of R and Python. I need to be able to use that rather than spending the next 2 years training them to SaaS, on top of training them to clinical study and to clinical development. I want to be able to use that right away, more than just, I love the idea of a new language.
Thanks, Olivier. And Mike, I know that you talked, that James sort of brought your name up in terms of the experiences that you talked about earlier. So I don't know, maybe you want to add to those, add to the discussion regarding your experiences with the PHUSE projects that have been going on in that space.
Yeah, and that PHUSE project has largely been aimed at kind of trying to compare apples to apples of the implementations of common statistical analyses that we do. When it comes down to trying to pick the right tool for the job, as we approach things like getting into large bootstrapping models or Bayesian analyses, looking at something like Julia makes sense because in some languages, implementations that could take days to run could be run in hours because of the tools that Julia has available. But do we need to flip all of our standard descriptive statistics over to using Julia? Not necessarily. And then I think something that a lot of times when we're looking at embracing open source within our ecosystems and the walls that we have available, a lot of automation is something that Python is particularly strong for, even if you're not looking at it as a statistical language candidate. But automating a lot of your activities or doing that PDF compilation or something like that, Python might be the right choice if you don't already have something in-house. Something that I've always hated doing in SAS particularly is trying to do system operations, but it's something that's very native to a general purpose language like Python that is designed more for activities like that. So we don't need these kind of monolithic beasts where every single thing that we do is written in SAS, and that's the only language that we use to do anything at all. Even if you don't want to move your analyses away immediately, there's room for using R for creating beautiful reports or shiny applications as some place to start. That was another question that I saw in the chat of or in the Q&A of where do you dip your toe in the water. Look at things like making really nice reports in R Markdown or using Python for automation activities. There's non-statistical activities that we have to do on a daily basis that these languages can start making really easy and starting to embrace them now and taking advantage of it.
Yeah, Mike, I agree with that. I just want to add a comment, and every time Olivier and yourself say something, I get inspired to add a comment, so you need to be ahead of my panels in the future as well. But I think in terms of the R-SAS interaction, I want to add a word there. That is exactly why we have added support to these languages, so that you can run R when you want it, but also execute some code in the SAS engine itself in a smooth and transparent way. As was pointed out, in these multilingual environments, clearly that will be helpful. There is a danger, of course, that you increase the complexity of what you're putting up and that you need to qualify more languages and more packages, and that there is a threshold there in how to do that. We definitely want to keep investing in that and make it easy for pharmaceutical organizations to do that. In a way, the word post-competitive is important. From our point of view, open source has actually helped us tremendously to become, again, clear on what we want to invest in. And we keep investing in advanced analytical techniques and statistical inferential techniques, because it all gets thrown on one heap, right? Inferential statistics, data science, text analytics, but these are entirely different families of analytical techniques. So invest in those and keep those as something that is for us part of our IP and patented, and that we will never open. But on the other hand, post-competitively collaborate with other languages and capabilities, so that pharma companies and statistical programmers can have the best experience that they need in that qualified sense, in that reliable sense that we mentioned, robust sense. So I think we always need to keep in mind the total cost for doing this and what the patient deserves, and that's a speedy approval, right, of the innovative therapies that are being developed. So that's what we try to do.
Thanks, Mark. And Mike, you sort of raised the question that was in the that's come in from the audience around what would you tell a group that is curious but not sure where to begin to start that transition to open source. So I'm actually going to throw that over to Andy to maybe start on that one.
So, hi everyone, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Internet.
Sorry, Andy, you're quite quiet there.
I'm quite quiet. Let's see if I can. Do you want someone else want to comment on that, and then I'll see if I can boost sound somehow.
So maybe I'll throw that to James initially then.
Yeah, so I guess for transitioning into open source, I mean, definitely pick where it's relatively simple, and I'm sure the others on this call will be able to jump in with examples from their own experiences. But, you know, think exploratory rather than regulatory when you're starting out. You know, think about where is R actually bringing you benefit. If you have a massive catalog of TLGs and SAS, you know, that's not where you're going to have immediate wins. If it's more exploratory statistical analyses, maybe that's a better place to start to dabble with these other languages like Julia and Python and R.
Thanks, James. Andy, how's the volume now?
Can you hear me any better? You can tell me.
Perfect. Yes, very clear. Yes.
Okay. So hopefully no problems. Fingers crossed. So starting out, I think the biggest challenge you've got when starting out is you need people who really want to move to open source. It's not something you can sort of say top down. Yeah, we're going to move to open source. Let's start now. You need the people to have the enthusiasm to drive that change. To some extent, my background in open source was one of the drivers at GSK, coming in, helping rewrite training materials and things like that. And obviously, in terms of the practical writing, getting some materials, and might not have to write them, bring someone in, but getting some basic training, getting a sort of groundswell of basic knowledge is important. I think then the challenge beyond that is then to try and find practical opportunities to use the open source tools and languages. So that's not, I think it's been touched on, that's not replacing what we do today and going straight for that, but looking at new opportunities. So in the case of R, we were looking at things like Shiny, R Markdown, things like that can add a benefit. So starting to look at some of those use cases and really get the enthusiasm. But ultimately, you do need those enthusiasts, and you need those subject matter experts to come in and help drum up enthusiasm. Just
to add to that, Andy, I definitely agree when you mentioned Shiny. I think that's been a bit of a gateway drug for a lot of companies into the multilingual world. And if you look at conferences like 3 years ago, it was disturbingly focused on interactive analyses, like just dominating the discussion.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's sort of obvious in hindsight when you look at the power of something like Shiny. But yeah, if you're just going to say, right, we're going to use R or Python, and we're going to, Mike touched on this earlier, and we're just going to replicate what we do today. No one's going to be very enthusiastic about that. But if you can show how you could do something different, and Shiny is, by far and away, what the leading tool in that space for people who who aren't full stack web developers, who for analysts, for programmers, for statisticians, data scientists who want to get in, show results in a different way or communicate with study teams in a different way. Shiny is definitely the tool to get into, and if you want to know Shiny, you've got to know R. So there's your gateway in. And I think once you're into R, it opens the gateway to Python and so on and so forth. So these things kind of spiral. I think once you've got over that first hurdle of learning something else and you've started to become multilingual, the thirst for other things grows, but equally so does the ease with which you can add in other tools into that tool set.
Thanks. I'm going to start trying to work through some of these questions that are coming in, because they're coming in thick and fast, and I'll try and get through as many as we can in the 15 minutes we've got remaining, roughly. But if you do have a question, please do submit it, and we will try and get to it. I have had one question around contact information for this group. What I would suggest is if you do want to get in touch with anybody here, we can certainly help facilitate that through PHUSE, through the working groups at phuse.global email, and I'm sure you can find many of these panel through various professional networking systems, say LinkedIn, so like LinkedIn on that side. So I'm sure that they would welcome any questions or comments through those avenues. So I'm going to hit this question first, and I'm going to give it to Olivier initially. Are there internal challenges, so like IT or quality groups, that might hamper progress in using open source?
It's a very good question, Chris. And yes, there are a lot of internal. I think the first internal challenges comes with the teams, because I'm seeing it. There's a lot of people who say, well, I've been using SAS forever. Why move now? So the discussion there are the first, and so we touch on that. You have challenges potentially with your stat team. In the sense, you say, well, we're using R. If you start to use it widely in a controlled way, does it mean I'm no longer able to download that package from my, roommate in Stanford or in MIT that I've been using to do a bit of exploratory? Yes, informatics groups will say like, well, suddenly you're going from something which is very easy for me from a procurement point of view, which is to talk to one vendor, and you want me to talk to a lot of vendors. And I have small, big, middle, some I've never heard from. So I think, involving your IT group very early in the process and discussing the why and discussing all the implication, and, they would slides around the governance process, how you select the vendors, how you select the packages, how you're validating them. There will be definitely, discussions, and if you don't process it, then that will be a real challenge. the quality side, of course, and as I say, is earlier, the challenge is I don't have one document I can go and say, hey, this is what the agency wants us to do it, because it's a level of granularity which I think they want to give us autonomy and freedom to do, as long as we follow the big guidances that are coming from the FDA, the ICH, and so on. So I think here again, you need to engage with your quality team as you're going through this. But I would say the mistake I've seen being done on regular occasion when you discuss open source is almost like go to them and say, hey, what's your opinion? What do you recommend? And I think realizing, well, that the vast majority of them, they have not been exposed. So I think, it's one of these opportunity where as, data scientists, data engineers, statistical programmer, it's an opportunity for us to take the lead. So like, hey, I've looked into this. This is, I understand the positions. There might be no, guidance we can refer to, but these are the good practices. This is what FHUSE, this is what Transliterate, this is what others, and then come with a kind of your position on it. So I think, yeah, there will be a lot of challenges along the way. And that's the main challenge, as I keep repeating. There's nothing you can refer to. It's not like, hey, this is how you implement BMO, or this is how you implement ADAM. It's really like everybody's doing it slightly differently. But, the need for discussions, and I think that was, Andy referring to it, a couple of people to drive it and say, we want to make it happen. I think, these are the key success factor to overcome any internal challenges you will face.
Thanks, Olivier. And I think, James, you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you that, it's something they may not know that well, and especially when you start saying, hey, I got this one off GitHub, I got this one off this random thing called Cran, where, I don't physically know where it is, but it's this place that we download stuff from. And, they're immediately thinking back to, could there be viruses? Could there be malicious code? Which I don't think any of us are even starting to think about. I guess I have seen a kind of shift, though, in the way the quality departments embrace this. When they start thinking more, okay, well, we don't want to go in and validate, they're not going to validate an R package, and they're probably not going to validate the R packages. They're going to come in and validate the system. And I think when they start thinking like that, you start moving towards somewhere where actually maybe it's a bit of an easier task. I'm worried about the code that touches the data that then goes on to regulators. And I think then you can start having more discussions. And I saw the person who sent this was from Roche, so I can send you a link to the new process that we have at Roche. And that simplifies it a lot. So it helps make validation something where you're talking hopefully a day to get a package validated, assuming it's not a terrible package and needs remediation. And I think this is something which hopefully will spread across the other pharma companies as well. And I know from talking to people from other companies, there's a similar sentiment. We just need to have good quality code that we can trust and have that inside a system that is then validated. And I don't know if I'm allowed to plug other conferences, but there's a conference coming up that's quite big in the R world where the Roche process is being open source and presented. So definitely look out for that in 2 months.
That's our pharma, just to state it out loud.
I'll forgive that one side plug going on this time.
I think you guys have an agreement to collaborate, so it's okay.
With our consortium, yes, we have an agreement, yes. We've sort of talked about agencies a little bit, and we touched on this question that was submitted earlier, there's a comment around sort of missing the view of FDA in this discussion. Obviously, none of us in this call can speak on behalf of the agency, and nothing that is sort of discussed at CSS should be taken as the opinion of the agency. All FDA folks who are contributing to these discussions are contributing in a personal capacity, and but bringing in their experiences as we work collaboratively together. None of us, when we have discussions at CSS, represent our companies. We're all representing our individual selves as we work together. Having given that big caveat piece, I know that there's some work going on in the data visualization and open source technology working group that's looking at pilot submissions around R. So maybe Mike, if you want to maybe sort of talk to that effort that's going on.
Yeah, and I think something important to understand is that while we're not, I don't think that we should be expecting some big statement of approval. What we have is that statistical software clarifying statement that Andy brought up earlier, and then the additional paragraph there that says that you should do sufficient testing to make sure that you trust the software. So that's really the broad statement that we have to go on from the agency that says it's okay, just that the ownership is on you to demonstrate that it is so. But while we don't have a voice from them here, we do have representatives from the agency participating in some of these groups within the R Consortium group. We have participation from Paul Schutte, who's very active in the R Consortium, R Pharma world, and speaking about usage of R and the things that, at least from his personal experience, from using it at the agency. So we do have these voices. We have a representative in clinical statistical reporting from a multilingual world. One of the benefits of FUSE is the relationship that we do have the agency to request resources on these projects. But it's just the capacity at which they can contribute, being a regulatory agency, is going to always be, you're not going to get distinct approvals, and I don't think that we can accept that from them. So I know that a lot of what we're looking for in industry is that success story. And I think that we're going to see those at some point in time. Anecdotally, you hear of people using things in submissions. One of the things that we are hoping to do in the R Consortium project is just get that demonstration that we can put our code, our R code, through the ECTD. One of the distinct things that we're trying to pilot there is to deliver an R package through the ECTD. It's not as easy as it sounds, just because of some of the requirements. But then there's other things out there looking at trying to modernize that path. We'll get there. We'll have those success stories at a point in time. And while we don't have people standing up and just expressing that, yes, thumbs up to all these things, and we shouldn't expect that just because there's plenty of ways to do it wrong. So you don't want to just go ahead on a falsehood that you get a thumbs up that R is okay, and then you just use your friend's R package on GitHub in a submission that does 2 + 2 = 5, and then you get a failure there. So it's we have the statistical software clarifying statement. We have collaboration from representatives from the agency, and one of these days we'll get that success story that gives everyone the comfort that they're looking for. But meanwhile, we have plenty of efforts charging ahead.
Thanks, Mike. For the next question, I'm going to actually go to Sam to start to give a CDISC perspective on this piece from the COSA side. And the comment is that FUSE and CDISC could recommend a list of open source packages. Sam, maybe I'll let you answer that first before I find something to maybe speak for FUSE.
For the Open Source Alliance, I mean, that's one of our intentions, is to, again, create a directory and raise awareness of what's available and what's out there, and kind of build a community so there's more communication, so people get a greater comfort level. Users can share stories and things of that nature. So that's one of our primary intentions, is to make it easy to find out about these applications and to get information about them. And so that's really what the directory is about. And certainly there'll be overlap, I'm sure, with some of the things that that maybe FUSE is doing, and I think that's perfectly fine. And again, we'll seek to collaborate on that. So that's a little bit about, from a COSA perspective, how we plan to not only put the directory out there, but really start to push to raise awareness of what's available.
Yeah, and I think from a FUSE perspective, it's a similar view in that I think recommend is a very strong word here. I think it's around sharing and pointing people in directions, and it's for people to make up their own mind around their comfort levels and the reliability of what's out there. I think, Andy, you alluded to that earlier when you introduced the topic. But I think we can certainly work together with CDISC as a FHUSE organisation to see how we can use the wisdom of the crowd to help with some of those spaces. So the next question, I'm actually going to throw across to Mike, and I'm actually going to put this one on the screen because it's to me it's quite technical. It's what do you think about the plotty / Python versus shiny / R? Is plotty used in clinical data science?
Yeah. So. Anyone who's followed open source has inevitably seen the R versus Python debate, which one's better, which one's going to come out on top. And I think that what this really comes down to is why has pharma gravitated towards R? And the answer to that, in my opinion, depends on usage. So we're very used to statistical programming languages that are statistics first, that are geared towards using a language that is built with the activity that it was purposed for in mind. So R is a statistical programming language. SAS is a statistical programming language. Python is a general purpose language. So you see Python out there a lot in the machine learning world and in a lot of the server-side processing and in many different things, and it kind of evolved these statistics capabilities. But in these systems where you're using Python, one of the advantages is that if you're working in a software group and you try to hand off R code to someone, they're probably going to be really frustrated because it's quirky, it's geared towards statistics, and it has a lot of weird design things into it that a person coming from a C++ or a Java or a world like that is going, or Python is going to look at it and ask what's going on here, I don't get it. And it's just the nature of the language, but that's something that we're used to, so we gravitate towards it. So in clinical research, we tend to see R and R shiny because it's something that we can do the activities that we're used to in the typical analysis, and then we get these capabilities with it. So that's just one reason that I think that we gravitate towards it. Plotly dash, I have seen it used in different places, but you're starting to slip into other groups within the organization that might not be as geared towards the clinical reporting activities.
Thanks, Mike. The last remaining question we have in the system is, have you encountered any security issues? And if so, how have you handled them when considering using open source code? I don't know if somebody would like to pick that one up. I'm not sure where to necessarily direct that one, if somebody wants to jump in to comment on that.
I just have a general statement that a lot of the analysis that we do is in closed systems, that a lot of the work that we do is kind of staying in the network. You're not doing a lot of inter-server communications, so which makes us, to some degree, a lower risk. When you get into the world of Shiny and stuff like that, you start getting more concerned at security at an architecture level. So I've never seen any concerns. There are R packages that can do scans for security issues, but a lot of that stuff goes down to network communication. And there's different practices that you need to put in place there. So hardening processes and all that become relevant when you're dealing with web servers, and that's when you can start looking at more proprietary products for hosting solutions and things like that. But as far as just general statistical analysis, no, I don't really see much of a concern there.
I agree with that. In terms of, in terms of how we host those systems, I think there could be a difference in the way that the effort that you need in terms of hardening the system, dependent if you can kind of test, if you have the testing documentation, if you look at that. And so certainly hosting open source by itself is similar to SAS or to any other technology, but it is all about ownership and governance and where to go back to and finding, being able to test that out. And so if you do that in an enterprise context, in a cloud context, and you're opening up patient data that could be exposed externally, that could cause an issue if you cannot test or if you cannot harden that regularly. So it comes down to who is willing to take up the ownership of the risk involved in that, I think.
I think
when we talk about open source tools, go ahead, Andy.
Go ahead, Andy.
I'll just come in on that, and just a word of warning almost for this. One area where I see some challenges around security and coming a bit more than just general open source is when you start talking about things like Shiny and building apps, as we touched on. I think that's where you're moving out of the realms of traditional statistician programmer and moving into software development, where you're going to have IT groups have certain practices around the development of applications, and they have certain concerns. When you talk about, I'm building an application, there are immediately a bunch of other regulations and things you're going to have to follow internally within your organization. So I guess it's just worth highlighting that that's a question that's going to come up. You can get around, not get around it as such to avoid this, but we've done a lot of work internally to talk about apps. To get our quality groups and our IT groups to think about the apps, like the Shiny apps, for example, that we build, more like plots or like tables that we produce, as opposed to applications. So yes, they're deployed within a system, and that system needs all of the relevant security checking, as Mike said. Often you have a closed system there, but you're not repeating all these kind of security checks and everything for every single Shiny app, because I've seen organizations start to move down that route before. So that's something that's a discussion to definitely have with quality groups and get the way they think about something like an app. Sorry, James.
Yeah, and I think definitely to carry on from that, there's definitely some examples which are purely down to user errors when they get into these languages. So you talk about security issues. Git probably causes security issues all of the time because people move to it, they're not used to it, and they commit their passwords. So I think it's definitely kind of a change management training question. And it's the same thing with Shiny apps. Like we're a Google-based company, so we have the OAuths to make Shiny apps a little bit more secure to log into. But if you wanted to start talking about asking users to pass a password into a Shiny app, and then, there could be occasions where that's writing to log and stuff like that. So I think there's definitely a worry on the user side when they're not used to these tools, accidentally, essentially making their own password public by accident.
Thanks. And I think Sam, you wanted to add. Yeah, I think Sam, you wanted to add something as well quickly there.
For core, for our open rules engine, for example, we'll go through static application security testing, SAST. So that's a pretty common step that a lot of open source projects go through. And then we'll also actively bring in a security team to review it. And that's not unusual for many open source projects, and that can be available with the documentation. So my experience is, one of the first questions we get about open source a lot is around support and things like that. Well, who do I call, when things go wrong, and what assurances do I get? And so I think the idea of having commercial support is not a bad idea for many organizations. That aside, my experience working with open source is they're very responsive to security issues. And oftentimes, because especially if you have a broad user base, they'll get things patched much faster than what you might see in some commercial environments.
Great, thanks, Sam. We have one last question, which I'm going to try and ask the panel to answer quickly, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. This might be spectacularly difficult, because I think we could probably have an entire panel discussion on its own. But we can maybe at least get some very quick initial opinions on that. There's been a discussion presentation on interactive outputs, e.g. forest plots, which are all very exciting. Can we comment on how QC and validation might be handled for interactive outputs, where typically we've done independent QC for static tables and figures? I don't know if somebody maybe wants to just address that quickly with initial thoughts. So Andy, maybe I'll hand over to you quickly.
Yeah, all I would say on this is that it's a very much an evolving space that many companies are trying to tackle. I haven't seen a good concrete answer. I've seen the approach of, well, everything that we produce when we do things interactively, there are lots of different. I mean, if you've got an interactive display, there's like an infinite number of possibilities almost that potentially that can come out of something like an app and that display. So can we just take the things that we're interested in and then recreate them statically? I've seen that, but I don't think it's a long-term solution. And then on the flip side, there's let's treat it like a validated piece of software and go through a very, very heavy validation process. And I don't think that's the right solution either. So I think it's an open question still, and the answer lies somewhere in the middle. I think we need more of a sliding scale between our traditional sort of QC of an output, a table or a graphic, through to something that's a bit more heavyweight in terms of software validation, but isn't as heavy as what our IT groups would be used to.
Olivier, I'll hand over to you for the final word on this.
And so I'm going to close the loop. Yeah, I'm going to close the loop. Change of mindset. You cannot. And I think, to end this point, you cannot validate the thousands of ways people can use it. So I think we need to be clear to you're going to validate the most common use case, but then after that, because the validation can be, well, if you select a silly subgroup and you select a silly endpoint, and then you get a package or an output out of it, well, you've just done something silly. I cannot validate silly things. So I think it's that change of mindset in the sense of, yeah, you do your best to make sure that when you click, it does what it's supposed to do. If the user is asking something silly, the answer is silly. And that's why often the way to compensate for that, well, if you do generate something for interactive, don't go and show it directly to the FDA. Go back, or the EMA, or the PMDA. Go back to the knowledgeable people and ask them to run a validated analysis to ensure that this is making sense, and have a statistician and a clinician reviewing it.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And a huge thank you to all of you for joining the session. I think it's been really, really insightful, and I think that there's a lot that we can take advantage of moving forward.